is a very exciting session on minority identities and disability arts. And I just want to say, so I'm Anna McMullan, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm Professor of Theatre in Film, Theatre and Television. And this session partly came about because of a wonderful confluence of a number of different activities that we're having at the university this week. So one of them is the fact that on the second year BA course in Film, Theatre and Television, we have a module called Performance and Identity. And that module really looks at the complexity of identity, all the many different factors that go into our sense of identity, how we identify ourselves, how we self-identify, and how maybe identity is imposed on us, how perhaps labels, categorizations of identity are imposed on us that we have to negotiate and in some senses resist. And we also look at how theatre and performance might intervene in the construction, performance, and representation of identity, either in some ways, in sort of more mainstream representations, perhaps to actually normalise some of those dominant senses of identity and reinforce norms of identity, or in other cases to really question them and to give a voice and to give visibility to more marginalised identities. So today the audience includes members of that performance and identity cohort. Now our wonderful lecturer in Theatre and Creative Industries, Lucy Tyler, has also been organising a number of events in collaboration with South Street, who are a wonderful partner in FTT, and those have included this week working with playwright Andy Smith. And so we're absolutely delighted to have Andy here. I also want to say that I have had a previous life in what is now Film, Theatre and Television, and used to be called, in prior decades, Film and Drama, in the sense that I was a lecturer when Film and Drama was in the other campus over in Bulmershe in the early 1990s. And while I was there, what is now the Theatre Arts Education and Deaf Studies was in fact there on that Bulmershe campus, part of the education department there. And while I was there, I saw a number of really terrific productions by those students that absolutely knocked my socks off. I remember a couple of productions of Lorca, for example, A Blood Wedding. And the thing that really struck me was the way in which sign language was incorporated into the choreography of the work. And so, although unfortunately the Theatre Arts Education Deaf Studies programme is being phased out, the education BA is going to pick up, I think, on some of those, some bits of that. But we are absolutely delighted to welcome the TADES students here this afternoon. And so this is really a bringing together of a number of different constituencies and wonderfully fortuitous events that we're holding in FTT this week. So, how this seminar is going to run out, and I'll to perform, is that I'm going to introduce Simon, and Simon Floodgate is then going to talk about TADES and theatre, arts education and deaf studies much more generally. We're then going to hand over to Andy, and he's going to talk a little bit about his work and in particular the latest play that is in development with us at the moment on South Street. And then Lucy's going to chip in and add her thoughts to the mix. And then we will open it up to you, and you will have a chance to ask some questions. And we're going to aim to let you out in time to have a little bit of a break, before the next session, which you're also invited to, which, and I know some of you can't make that, but which is in fact a reading of Andy's new play. And there is also going to be a public interview with Andy that Lucy is holding at 6 o'clock. So it's a very exciting programme of events. So we're going to kick off, and we're really grateful to Simon Floodgate, who's Programme Director of TADES and Subject Leader for BGCE Drama. And he's going to talk about deaf theatre arts. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Anna.
Very welcome.
Right, let's get my...
Yeah, that's good.
Can you sit and see your slides?
Yeah. Okay, good. Yay! Okay, yes, hello. So I organised for a couple of articles to be sent round. I think all of you hopefully would have had those. And those talk about kind of disability performance in a broader context. And I kind of just want to flag a couple of things from those that are relevant. One is about kind of models of disability within society. And I'm not going to go into great depth at this point about them, but we have evolved from a medical model more to a social model where the problem around disability is society rather than the individual. And now in kind of disability arts, there's kind of more, we're in a sort of pioneer stage where we're moving perhaps to other models at the moment. The other thing, the chapter I wrote about performing disability very much focused on a question of verisimilitude. And that's particularly relevant when disabilities are visible. And there's questions in that I think are going to be relevant to the discussion. But what I've been asked to focus on, and what I'm going to really talk about, is deaf practice in theatre. And of course, deafness, however we might define it, some would call it a disability, some would define it as deaf people as a cultural minority. However we define it, it's a hidden impairment. So there are kind of some differences as well as similarities. I could have done so much today. I'm going to contextualise a little bit by talking a touch about some deaf theatre history, particularly in the UK, just to contextualise the work that TADES has done. And then I want to focus very much on what we call sign theatre, and more of that later. I'm going to conclude then with some clips, just a few short clips from some of our previous productions, which hopefully exemplify some of the points I'm going to make and possibly raise further questions. So away we go. So the big question really to kind of frame all this is, when we're talking about deaf practice in theatre, are we focusing upon access for deaf audiences and deaf performers, or are we focusing on the aesthetics in terms of using deaf culture? And by deaf culture, I do mean very much largely sign language, deaf sign language, which is a huge element of deaf culture. This is going back 11 years now. But there was a report done in 1996 about deaf people going to the theatre. And I just want to read this quote to you from about whether theatre is accessible or not. And it says, "Simply providing a signer does not guarantee a good night out for deaf people, as deaf people, and also interpreters, have a range of language from pure British Sign Language to sign support in English. There are also varying levels of skill in understanding and in production, and deaf people themselves use differing linguistic styles and accents in BSL." Now, little potted thing about sign language in BSL. British Sign Language. So around the world, countries all have their own sign language in the way that we all have our own verbal languages. And also within that, there are regional variations. Just as within the UK, you'll find regional variations in spoken language, there are regional sign variations. So how numbers are signed in Newcastle is different to how they're signed in Manchester, is different to how they're signed in London, for an example. To contextualise here as well, British Sign Language often seen as central to deaf people with a capital D, who are born deaf, grow up with sign language, and identify themselves as culturally deaf, is usually delivered without voice. And its syntax, its grammar, its structure is different to that of English. It's a visual spatial language. You'll get a little bit more taste of that later. Whereas sign supporting English is what it says. It's signs that work with the same syntax, the same grammar as English. It supports the vocal language. So with sign supporting English, you can sign and voice at the same time. With BSL, you can't. Those are quite important terms for later. So what is deaf theatre? Is it something like on the left, where most of the theatre in this country in the 1920s was through deaf social clubs? Not particularly progressive, but this is the York Deaf Social Club in the early 1920s on the left, and a more recent third-year production from Tayards on the right, where we've got two people signing at the same time. So no signing, as you can see, on the left, central signing on the right. But I want to go back a little bit further just clipped off the end there, 1886. And this is one of the earliest records of a performance in this country with sign language in for deaf audiences. And here we go. At that well-known place of entertainment, the Hearns, Kensington, London, a curious performance was given the other evening before a deaf and dumb dramatic club. You might be getting a sense of how this was viewed at that point, a deaf and dumb dramatic club. Of course, the dialogue was entirely represented by the movements of their fingers. It might have been supposed that some light comedy or farce would have been selected, but on the contrary, Hamlet, it was much curtailed. There were about 600 people in the theatre, the majority deaf and dumb of both sexes. Of course, the performance was tedious, and especially so to those invited to attend who did not suffer from the happy infirmity. This is 1880s. It was a strange and quite novel experiment, and it is worth noting as an illustration of what art can do to overcome infirmity. Yes, with some people pulling faces there. There's some attitudes towards disability and towards deafness there that we might not quite agree with today. Jump forward decades to 2012, when we had the Olympics and the Paralympics in this country, and the Globe Theatre put on the Globe to Globe Festival and covered all of Shakespeare's productions. They did Love's Labour's Lost with definitely theatre and prioritised the language BSL with this performance. Now, just note some of the differences here from the review, or one of the reviews. The fluid translation of Shakespeare into British Sign Language throughout the performance captured the imagery of Shakespeare's words in ways that made the auditory elements of language almost superfluous. This is not to suggest that the hearing audience understood every word. Certain lines from this pun-laden play challenge intelligibility even when conventionally performed. Thankfully, the Globe Theatre placed 2 electronic screens on either side of the thrust stage. Instead of displaying Shakespeare's text, these helpful panels simply summarised key actions. In other words, Don Armando recites a poem entitled Spring and Winter. Now, not having to decipher the core meanings of Elizabethan text freed the audience to appreciate how well the talented pool of deaf actors played gold and physically expressed subtext. So that's a very different view and attitude to work by deaf performers, deaf actors, than the 1880s. Thank God. So, deaf practice in theatre, what are we talking about? Are we talking about companies or productions that incorporate deaf actors? Is that what we mean? Do we mean it's performances that incorporate deaf sign language in some way? Are they aimed at deaf or deaf and hearing integrated audience? Who is the audience for this work? And are they addressing deaf issues or not? Now, in the 70s, 1976, Dot Miles, who unfortunately has passed away now, but was a renowned British Sign Language deaf poet and deaf actress, went to America, North America, worked with the National Theatre of the Deaf there, and whilst there, defined two forms of theatre for deaf audiences. So one, with Lou Fant, she called sign language theatre. And this was where a text, a dramatic text written by a hearing playwright, was taken and translated into sign language to make that accessible for deaf and hearing audiences. Yeah? And they contrasted that with what they called deaf theatre, which was purely for deaf audiences, with deaf actors, addressing deaf issues. And they really saw a complete difference between those two. So, deaf theatre used to be, and I think things have changed in the last 10, 15 years, used to be a rejection of an artistic mode of sign presentation. So, you know, there is no pure BSL, but a pure kind of let's use the language, not an artistic interpretation of how it might entwine with other languages of the stage. And a belief that the prominence should be placed on deaf actors and that the performance, as I say, in pure BSL, the language of deaf people. Yeah, so it used to be much more deaf actors using deaf sign language for deaf audiences around deaf issues. And I think that's changed a lot. And I think one of the companies that actually emerged from TEDS, Definitely Theatre, who are currently the only professional, I'm just thinking about that, maybe not the only now, but the prior deaf professional theatre company in the UK probably would have adhered to this. But now they're working much more for integrated deaf hearing audiences, and it's changed their practice. So I mentioned this moment. I think it was an important moment in so many ways, the moment of 2012 and the Paralympics. One of the articles that I forwarded around was by Colette Conroy, who actually talked about the opening ceremony of the Paralympics, co-directed by Jenny Seeley, the artistic director of Grey Eye Theatre, our main professional disabled theatre company. And asked questions about it. But there was a panel I went to on August the 31st that year, and I just want to draw attention to the practitioners there who defined their work in different ways, and it's really quite interesting. So Ramesh Mayapan, who is currently also a lecturer on the new BA in, let's get this right, Performance in BSL and English at the Conservatoire in Glasgow. So in its second year now. I'm actually the external examiner for it. And he teaches on the course as well. And that's for deaf actors. But he called his own work Sign Mime. And what he says is it's physical theatre, but I'm drawing upon all the kind of visual elements accessible to both deaf and hearing to make this work. And I'm just going to show you a little clip, actually, of a production of his called Snails and Ketchup. It's a kind of trailer clip for a couple of minutes, so we'll just watch that now. Then. Fingers crossed this will work. Yeah, so he's combining a whole load of stuff there. Circus skills, physical theatre, mime very clearly. And mime is an important aspect of sign language anyway. Representing iconic objects using your hands is a big part of deaf sign language. But I hope you'll notice as well, it's not just about the hands and the fingers, it is actually about the facial expression is important, and often becoming a character as well. When he kind of becomes the snail at one point, he actually becomes a character in that. Briefly, I could talk about this at length. I mean, actually, you could say it draws on filmic elements in terms of you can go into close-up and become a character, and you can go into long shot, and actually a finger might be that character walking down the street. We're using what we call classifiers within the language there. That's another presentation. So that's Ramesh. Hello, I've got stuck. Why is that not working? So back to the panel. At the same panel, we had Sophie Woolley, another deaf artist. She was preparing a piece for deaf-hearing children's audiences called The Bee Detective. And she said, I use a combination of sign-supported English and BSL, and she called it stage sign. Jenny Seeley, I've mentioned, who, with Grey Eye and the ceremony for Paralympics. She very much talks about the interpreter in the mix. And this is what Grey Eye did really from the 1980s when they started. They said, we can have theatre, we can have a sign language interpreter at the side of the stage. That produces, if you like, a foreign language film head tennis situation for deaf audiences. Let's put that person in the centre of the stage. Let's bring them on stage, the interpreter in the mix. And Grey Eye very much still do that. And you're aware of the signer or signers in a performance being interpreters, not always and not necessarily becoming a character. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they do a bit of both. But that was at the heart of their practice. And she also said, in terms of access and how we use the tools for access, we want to be led by the ruling idea of the play. What's the vision for this production? And that determines how we use interpreting, sign language, captioning, audio description. And if you go, anybody seen any Grey Eye shows? One or two from good. You'll see all of these things in play. As a hearing member of an audience, I have to say personally, I love Jenny and I love her work, but I do find the split focus quite demanding as a hearing member of an audience. Where am I meant to look now? I've got access to everything. That's tricky. I've told her that. So she knows. Kate O'Reilly, very well-known playwright, deaf playwright. I believe you're going to talk about this play, Performance and Identity Students, Peeling, in 2002. Actually incorporated BSL within the text. There was a character who spoke in BSL, so it was actually not English in the written dramatic text. It was done as BSL. Very positive, proactive, accessible. Not been produced very often. I think there was the original production by Grey Eye, and since it's been done by Forest Forge a few years ago now. So, that's one of our big questions, is about employability of actors and who can play parts and so on and so forth. And Water and Weightless was also produced around that time in 2012. Now, she was the co-founder of a company called The Fingersmiths with Jenny Draper and Jean St Clair. Jean St Clair's interesting because she was a member of the original British Theatre of the Deaf. They used practice from North America, the National Theatre of the Deaf, which is sign theatre. And British Theatre of the Deaf's summer schools became eventually the Tayards course. So the practice that Tayards uses as sign theatre has its roots through the British Theatre of the Deaf and actors like Jean St Clair back to the National Theatre of the Deaf in North America. Anyway, she came up with two terms. One, she said we do a kind of theatricalised BSL. That's quite nice. And the other term she coined was different to sign mime, but she called it visual vernacular. Now, I'm no expert on visual vernacular, but it is very current within deaf performance at the moment, particularly deaf poets, deaf performance poets, who they don't use, if you like, kind of sign units which might be words as part of the lexicon, but they use the components of sign language, hand shape, hand placement, movement, so on and so forth, to create a kind of visual form of poetry. There's debates within the deaf world as to how accessible it is for deaf people. Say no more. So, what have we got? Sign mime, stage sign, theatricalised BSL, visual vernacular. All these different terms, which I think actually really shows the kind of rich territory that we're looking at about the audiences, deaf hearing integrated audiences, and what's the potential is on stage in terms of incorporating sign language and other elements of the stage in various ways. So, here we go. What we know about TAEDS, Theatre Arts Education and Deaf Studies. I'm not going to go into a great big history about it, but just to say that the course was an environment for deaf and hearing students to work together. We had a policy of total communication. That meant you could come as a hearing student with no sign language and you'd learn sign language. You could come as a deaf student whose first language was BSL and you didn't voice and you're fine. You could come as a deaf student with sign-supported English, fine. You could come as a deaf student who had no sign language whatsoever. All the students on the course would study British Sign Language unless it was your native first language and you were fluent in it. You didn't have to do the lessons in it. But the work would be produced out of the basis of BSL. And remember, BSL was the form that is you can't voice along with. The structures don't work. SSE you can, BSL you can't. We approached theatre on the programme from what we called a deaf perspective, which is a physical and visual perspective. If you want to go down the road of accessibility, the most accessible form, of course, is going to be some form of non-verbal work. Perhaps full-face mask, character mask work. Of the type that Trestle Theatre used to do and companies like Vamos Theatre do now. But there's a question around that. Because those companies, whilst they never use words, they do rely upon soundtrack, upon music, very, very much to communicate meaning. So it's not 100% accessible. What is? Mime used to be loved by deaf audiences. But what we worked on was this thing I've mentioned called sign theatre. And this is about how can we take dramatic texts and make them accessible and make them essentially a new form of theatre. So what is sign theatre? Well, I'm going to actually draw upon a lecturer from film and drama and film theatre and television who was around at the time that the course was spawned and has only just stepped away from the stage, I think, or may still be on it, I'm not sure. Still on it? Okay. Because Lib Taylor, how many people here know Lib? Oh, loads, okay. Lib actually taught on TAEDS in its early days, as other film and drama staff did then. And she wrote a couple of articles. And again, it's similar to Jenny Seeley's argument. She said this: to exploit the full potential of sign languages in theatre for both the deaf spectator, who desires a less fragmented experience, you know, the head tennis thing I was talking about, and the hearing spectator, who wants to engage more fully with the detail of sign language, it seems desirable to move the signer away from the edge of the stage and into the space which is coded as part of the theatrical event. So bring them in centre stage, but not just in the way that Grey Eye used to work, which is to bring an interpreter into centre stage, actually to make the actor at the heart of the theatrical event a signer. What is sign theatre? There you go. Sign language comes centre stage. It's not exactly BSL, it's not exactly SSE, because you're combining with the visual elements of the theatre, of the stage. All that communication that we make non-verbally anyway, in body language, in gesture, in proxemics, and so on, all combine with signing. So actually sometimes you don't necessarily need to sign something because it's obvious within the visual. Yeah? I'm going to say a bit more about how you might work with this artistically later when I show a clip. but it is, we're looking at some kind of artistic form. It's not pure, whatever pure BSL is, or SSE. It does stem from the language of BSL. It does stem from the syntax, the order. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. So if we have a sentence in English which is, how would you put it? It's a question. Do you prefer cats or dogs? Have I done this with you?
Yeah.
Do you prefer cats or dogs? Okay. Now, if I'm doing it in BSL, it just doesn't work. I've got to think visually and spatially. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go, yeah? They're cats, they're dogs, you like which? Yeah? And I have to put the question in my face as well. So that's just a very small example of how the structure, the syntax works. It's visual spatial thinking. Yeah? Do you prefer cats or dogs just wouldn't work if you tried to follow that structure in sign language. As I said, BSL, you can't voice at the same time. Clearly, it's very difficult. You get more complex phrases and sentences. You just cannot follow what I've just done with voice. So the voice and the sign is separated. So suddenly we've got more than one actor involved. We're splitting role. It could be that you've got a signer and a chorus of voices. Or a chorus of signers and one voice. But also we did this thing called what we call voice sign split, where you'd have two actors who would both play the same character, one voicing, one signing. And of course, if they were both hearing actors and they both knew sign language, they could be switching between them. I remember seeing a production we did in 2006, I didn't direct it, but with Puck, two hearing actors playing Puck. And they had great fun between them, sometimes signing bits together, sometimes voicing bits together and swapping. Yeah? Again, I'll show you a clip from another production which exemplifies that a little bit later. So essentially we're talking about some form of bilingual theatre. We've got, in this country anyway, English on the stage in some way, and we've got deaf sign language on the stage in some way, in some form. This is what I'm going to show you a clip from later, Wojciech, 2008 first year production actually. And the guy Ben on the left here played Wojciech, he's a deaf actor, didn't voice. And the other guy, Matt, was a hearing actor, and he doubled. But if you know Wojciech, Wojciech has a friend called Andre. So we were able to play with the fact that Matt could be Andre, yeah? So Wojciech was talking to his friend, but he could also be Wojciech, because he was voicing Wojciech. And therefore you start to say, well, is Andre actually a figment of his imagination? Is it just a creation in his head? But so you can see, same costume, same makeup, they don't look exactly the same. But often you try to find actors that were a similar height and in some degree similar looking. And then our two actresses there were actually part of a chorus of three who all played Marie. So sometimes we'd have three Maries on stage, sometimes one Marie would play one scene, another would play another. So it gave us, and they were hearing actors, but they could all sign. Voice gloss, the voice, I talked about the split of sign and voice. We didn't call it voice over or voice interpreting, because it's not a voice person at the side who's providing the voice for a deaf lecturer, for example. We called it voice gloss. And the important thing is that there's a synchronization. The voice has to match with the signing. And that, as I said, with the structure, the grammar of the sign language being different to the spoken language, that wasn't always easy. You'd have to work in great detail about, building in those momentary pauses or, to make sure that you kind of hit the end of a sentence or the end of a phrase together. Particularly difficult with Shakespeare. Some of you are finding at the moment. Translation, so translating the dramatic script, the written text, we would start with BSL grammar and BSL order. Well, actually, I always said, let's start with putting on his feet without any sign language at all. How much can we communicate just by moving the scene non-verbally? Then we add in the sign that we need. Yeah. So that's the kind of emphasis. But what that means is, when you bring in the voice gloss, to get this synchronization I'm talking about, it doesn't always work. Sometimes you've got to do a bit of what we call back translation. Rewrite, reconfigure the written line. Yeah? So that it would then help to match with the signing line. That's okay when you've got classics, where the playwrights are long gone and out of copyright. Not so easy perhaps with contemporary work with playwrights. And very problematic with Shakespeare. Which is why, if you cast your mind back to the Definitely production I talked about of Midsummer Night's Dream, they got round that by going, let's not put voice on stage at all, let's put some captions up, and it's all signing on stage. Yeah? We're not going to try and voice. We try to promote the idea of, let's work with the Shakespearean language as it is. Let's not back translate Shakespeare and see what's possible. The benefits of Shakespeare are the huge amounts of wonderful visual imagery within it. And so with sign theatre, I talk about a spect audience. A deaf hearing audience is a spect audience, coming from two Latin roots. Audire, meaning to hear, and spectare, meaning to behold, to see. So if we're talking about a deaf hearing audience, I call it a spect audience in relation to sign theatre. Okay, enough of me talking. Oh no, just need to do this before I show some clips. Current practice. Maybe I'll forward this round for you, but in terms of what's going on, I talked about Definitely Theatre. That's their website at the bottom there. I talked about the course at the Royal Conservatoire in Glasgow. That's their link at the top. Two other things. Grey Eye I've talked about, who've been doing a lot of touring in the north of the country in recent years. And also there's a project called Ramps on the Moon. Anybody come across Ramps on the Moon? Yeah, Andy has, yeah. Ramps on the Moon. It's a project, I think a 3-year project, huge Arts Council funding in it, for some regional theatres to work together to try to make integrated disabled theatre mainstream, not just a marginalised thing. So far they've toured The Government Inspector, which you can see little clips of on YouTube, last year. And then this year they're building up to doing The Who's Tommy. Be interesting to see. Tommy, which is touring this summer. And that's not just deaf practice, that's, you know, audio-visual description, physical disability, signing, interpreting, the works. So those are quite interesting to see. Time for some clips, I think, to finish off. So let's start with the well, the production we did of Wojciech was there was a whole promenade thing and immersive theatre-based thing on it and whatever. But then we got the audience to actually sit down for a conventional play, and this is the first scene between Wojciech and Andre. So you can see this kind of idea of voice sign split between Ben and Matt that I talked about.
This place is cursed, you know. You see that light strip on the grass there? A head rolls down it every evening. A man saw it once. Picked it up. Thought it was a hedgehog. 3 days and nights later, he was in his coffin. It was the Freemasons. Sure of it. Freemasons. Quiet. Can you hear it? Something moving. It's all hollow. Freemasons. Scary. Strange. Still. Make you hold your breath. Say something! How bright! It's all glowing above this house. A fire raging in the sky. And a permanent office comes towards me. Can you still hear it? Silence. Nothing but silence. As if the world was dead. The drums.
Okay, so yeah, sometimes between the two of them it's like a conversation between Wojciech and Andrzej, and other times it's very clearly that they're actually the same person. And whilst Matt did, he did a wonderful job in voice gloss with that, the key things he had to say was there's certain points where my body orientation needs to be the same, yeah, or the angle of my eye focus needs to be the same. If I'm looking up here but Ben's looking down there, then we're very much two different people. Yeah? So they found those moments to synchronize. And then, of course, he had to work out also about applying that voice gloss, as I say, because Ben couldn't hear him. Ben actually could not hear him. Ben was just signing, possibly more BSL-ish than theatricalized sign in that, actually. That was me as the director. I couldn't get it out of him. But anyway, the important point was about the voice sign split and the synchronization. I'm going to show you now an older clip from our production of The House of Bernarda Alba. And this is the opening. And two things, really. We're going to see the chorus of women. If you don't know The House of Bernarda Alba, it's kind of the death of the father, and the mother and all her daughters have to wear black and stay in the house for the whole play. So it's the chorus of women. And you actually see in this clip the figure of Lorca himself come out and actually perform his poem Elegy and link it to one of the characters, one of the sisters towards the end. But the chorus I want to draw your attention to in terms of the possibilities of sign. Because what we did was we looked at, they're all kind of oppressed and stuck in the house. So we took some, if you like, BSL lexicon signs, and we mixed that with some mime, I suppose, and create a kind of choreographic phrase. And so what the women did, as you'll see, is they start with a sewing needle as if they're sewing, and they take it from their gut, and they sew up through the heart, and as they bring it up, they then come into the sign for desire and longing, and they took that, which comes from the throat here, and they took the desire and longing out, kind of to get out of the house. But actually that's not allowed, so what they then did was take the sign for depression, and bring that down and push it back down into the body. And so this became a kind of choreographic sequence that they're all doing as the audience enters at the beginning of the play. And then you'll see him signing the poem, and not a voice sign split, but another character voicing for him.
thread of dreams lost forever. And in your soul, the longing still, unsatisfied, the passion's fire. A mother's dream of places where a child rocked in a cradle cries, and on your lips a broken thread of some forgotten lullabies. I see sad and broken life reflected deep inside your eyes. The sameness, your empty days, as you watch people passing you by. You listen to the bitter rain fall on the old provincial street, and far away, the muffled bells, their melancholy sound of
Okay, so that was, yeah, sorry, I went on a bit. That's where the audience kind of come in, so that's why they kind of were doing it for quite some time. That was a dress rehearsal, so there were no audience coming in. Yeah, trying to link Lorca with the women. I just want to draw attention to kind of a translation issue there. The line from the play was about longing, but actually what he signed was this, and he pushed that down, and that's the sign for sex and sexuality. So his longing was his sexuality, which he had to push down, which, if you know anything about Lorca, was kind of what he had to do during his lifetime. One final clip, yeah? Okay. Right, I want to show you a clip from, it's actually a student production from 2009. It got a first class mark. It was called Pistols and Pansies. It had three parts to it, and the part I'm going to show you is a little bit of the beginning of the second part, which used the play Face to the Wall by Martin Crimp. And Face to the Wall was all about school shootings. And actually they produced this at the time in 2009. There'd just been a school shooting of 15 pupils in Germany, at Vinenden, I think it was called, at that time. But yeah, just to show the combination of elements on stage and a kind of different way of thinking visually and using sign in this clip.
He shoots. Child A in the head. He moves on to child B. He shoots child B in the head. He moves on to child C. Child C, yes? Tries to duck away. What? Child C tries to duck away. He shoots child B in the head. He moves on to child C. Child C tries to duck away. He shoots. No. Yes. No. But to no avail. He shoots child A in the head. Moves on to child B. He shoots child B in the head. moves on to Child C. Child C tries to duck away, but to no avail.
Okay, so enough of a taste of it. So just some different possibilities about how sign can be used on stage, as I said, marrying with the other kind of elements of the language of theatre. That's it really. Teids, as many of you will know, is closing in the summer of 2018. So all go away, learn BSL and start to bring it into your practice. Sorry, I've gone on a bit.
Thank you so much, Simon. It's really great to get that overview of deaf arts practice and to have your expertise with us. So now, delighted to have you back with us, Andy, I believe. I believe you were here with us before, and some of our students might be familiar with you. For those of you who don't know Andy, Andy Smith is a writer, thinker and performer whose works include The Preston Bill, Commonwealth and All That Is Solid Melts Into Air. It's a great book. And he also works as a director, known of course for his work with Tim Crouch on plays such as Adler and Gibb and An Oak Tree. Andy is very much a thinker, having completed his doctorate in 2014, where he started and has continued to explore his particular aesthetic, what he calls dematerialised theatre. And I believe, Andy, that you'll also be talking a little bit more about that this evening in the interview as well. Yeah. So thank you so much. You're very welcome.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Lucy, for organising this. And thanks, Simon, for your overview. No thanks, though, for having that buzzing sound.
I don't think it's to do with it.
It's all right. Can work with it. You don't have any slides, I just have a buzzing sound. So, yes, shall I just start while it's on it?
Maybe if we put the projector there and put it in that.
See if you do this.
That might help.
No, only a little bit.
Oh, thanks, Stephen.
Sorry, Auntie.
It's all right. Is everybody all right? Yeah? It's really fine. Don't be sorry.
We're going to get some technical help. Which the buzzing.
No, you're all right. I'll talk and then we can...
Sounds like
I'll invite you in. What I'll do is I'll start and I'll let them sort it out around me. Yeah, it's okay. I shall be writing in my diary tonight. I shan't be going to Reading again. There's a buzzing sound as I spoke. It's fine. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm going to just talk for a bit and then we'll open it up to questions. I want to reflect a little bit, I suppose, on what I just heard, but also I want to talk to you about my work and then also about this particular work that I'm here to think and talk about more. So yes, I make work that I refer to as dematerialised theatre, on my own and with a man called Tim Crouch, and we have used that term since 2003, 2004 when we started working together. And that term comes from a book about conceptual art, a book of writing about conceptual art called 6 Years, the Dematerialisation of the Art Object. So a period of time where artists worked in ways which did more with less. That's what the phrase in Lucy Lippard's book 6 Years said. It was a period of time where conceptual artists started working with ideas that you tried to do more with less. Thank you. So we're interested in that. We're interested in the idea of doing more with less, which I think is slightly different to the idea of less is more. I think the emphasis is different. Can I do more with less? And if you know anything about conceptual art, you'll know that some of those pieces that were made in that period of time were just like instructions. So things that said, go and do this, or go and do this, or here's a postcard, or an artist called Sol LeWitt, an American artist, who used to send instructions to the gallery, just used to send instructions of what they should draw on the wall. So, the art was, I suppose, in my interpretation of it, that art existed very much in the viewer. What was happening in the viewer, or what the viewer could do to activate it, or what the people at the gallery would do to activate it. So it kind of shared the load a little bit. What it did was it I think, tried to work into making spaces for an audience that might see it, and question what the nature of art was. What is art? What can art be? What can it do? A very politically charged period of time between 1966 and 1972. All periods of time are politically charged in one way or another, but 1968 was a particular flashpoint, I suppose, in various places in the world. So, a theatre that might do more with less. And so I've spent a long time working with him and on my own to make a theatre that tries to make a similar kind of space for an audience, because I think the audience is the most important thing in the theatre. I think they're the most important thing. I can think of many, many examples of theatre without things, without actors, without lights, without costumes, without sets, without the stuff of theatre, even theatre that takes place outside of theatres, in empty factories or in playgrounds or stuff. But I cannot think of a single example of a theatre that does not have an audience. Can anybody here? Is it possible to have a theatre without an audience? I don't think it is.
It won't be a very successful one.
It wouldn't be a very successful one.
You could give it a go.
It wouldn't be one, I think. I don't think it would be a theatre. If I was just here on my own, talking, I don't think I could call it theatre. So, thinks about the audience. I think about the audience. And how I think about the audience, or how I want to think about the audience, is I want to make space in my work for the audience to be able to enter into it imaginatively and engage with it and be part of it. Because, as I've explained, the audience are important to me. So I've spent a long time with Tim and also on my own over the years making pieces of work that I refer to as dematerialised theatre, which often look just like this. Me in a room with a group of people like you, with me talking and you sitting there listening. And that to me is kind of the basics of theatre. I need a room called a theatre. It doesn't have to be a theatre. It can be a room, but just for the purposes of the performance, I'll call it theatre. I need a text to speak. I need an audience to listen. The idea of the audience being a listening thing. And that's about it. I can make a theatre if I have those things. And I started making work in this way because I just graduated from university and I didn't have any money. But I still wanted to make theatre. So that's how I started making theatre. And then slowly I became interested in it as an aesthetic, as a way of making, because of what I perceived to be the space that it could offer to an audience. And so that's kind of like a potted history of the work. It was often solo, not always, but it's often solo. It often looks like this. It asks what I think are important questions about what is theatre. What is theatre? I mean, I think a lot of people who make theatre don't often ask that question. They don't say, why am I making theatre rather than something else? What am I doing this for? Why am I interested in this? And one of the reasons that I'm interested in it is I'm interested in the capacity or the potential or the idea that might exist in a room full of people who are all there together. It's a very simple thing, but it feels like a fundamental and important thing. I'm also interested in asking questions through this theatre about acting. What is acting? And how do we act? How do we act like be characters, and how do we act as in like in society? How do we behave with each other? Ethical questions, but also questions of, how do we act? What is acting? Maybe I'm not qualified to say so, because the Irish Times wrote a review of a play that I wrote with my friend Tim, and said, very pointedly, in what was a favourable review, Andy Smith, who is not a professional actor. So they felt really important to say that I wasn't a professional actor. I don't know what that means. Does it mean that I didn't go to acting school? Maybe. Does it mean that I don't have the skills to become someone else? Maybe. I don't know what those skills are though, because I'm interested and I'm excited about the fact that theatre is a place where I think one thing can exist inside another thing. That's what theatre is. In a theatre, Andrew Scott can stand on stage and go, "Hi everyone, it's Andrew Scott," but he can say, actually, "Now I'm Hamlet." And that's acting. He might do some things to make him more Hamlet-like, or he might cut his hair in a certain way, or walk in a certain way, but fundamentally he's still Andrew Scott. But he's also Hamlet, because we've agreed for the duration of 2.5, 3 hours, or whatever it is the new Almeida production production lasts, that he's not Andrew Scott, he's Hamlet. So I'm interested in one thing existing inside another, and how much you have to do to say that that thing is happening. So how much do I have to do to say, for example, that these chairs are not chairs in Reading University, they're chairs in Brazil? How much do I have to do to make that happen? Well, I could make some projections that are Brazil, and I could light them in a more Brazilian way, whatever that means. But fundamentally, I think that on a baseline I can say, they're in Brazil now. And we can agree together that that's the frame that we've put around them. And we can imagine that these chairs are not chairs in Reading, they're in Brazil. So, I'm interested in playing with those ideas. And like I said, most of this work has manifested itself either through plays that are written by, and also in one instance with, my friend Tim Crouch, which I co-direct usually. I'm a director of his work and I help him develop it, his ideas. And then also I've made alongside that work, over the last 15 or 16 years, I suppose, a series of solo pieces. So solo pieces which are connected to storytelling, which are connected to ideas of solo work, autobiographical work, but fundamentally are more explorations into this idea of dematerialised theatre. And particularly in the last 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, particularly interested in how this form might be used to explore ideas of socio-political thought. So how we might use this form to think towards socio-political change, or think towards ideas that are connected to the world that we are currently in. Because it feels like quite a balanced form to me. I know I'm talking, and I know you're sitting there listening, but it feels like we're active in that together. It doesn't feel to me like you're passive, which is a lot of ways that people describe the audience that sit like this these days. It's interdependent. It's symbiotic. I need you to be there. And I hope that in some sense you need me to be here in order to have a reason for sitting looking in this direction and listening. So I'm interested in exploring that. And so I've explored that. And then last year, 2 years ago actually, nearly 2 years ago now, a producer that I work with, Louise Blackwell, from an organisation called Fuel, who produced my last solo work, The Preston Bill, said to me, "What are you thinking of next?" And I said, "Well, I've got a few ideas playing around in my head. Let me have a think about them and I'll get back to you on what they might be." And I had a few things in my head, a few formless hunches, a few things that were appearing and making me go, "Oh, that might be something to follow, that might be something for me to follow." The first thing that I had in my head, or one of the first things, was that I had an image of a person standing on stage signing. That's all I had. Just had an image in my head of somebody standing on stage signing. I also, a programmer called Neil Mackenzie, who runs a theatre in Crewe called Axis Arts Centre, wrote an introductory essay in one of his festivals that he programmed and mentioned me and talked about the work that I make as being a way to explore a meeting a meeting between performance and audience. So the word meeting was in my head. I'd also done a little bit of work with a friend of mine called Sue McLean, who recently made a performance called Can I Start Again Please, which was a performance by her and a deaf actor called Nadia Najara, and the two of them sat side by side and they signed and they spoke. And I'd done a bit of work with Sue, and Sue had also, she works as an interpreter, she'd also interpreted some work by me. And also I did a couple of performances of the Preston Bill with a man called Michael Bow, who interpreted the solo performance, the Preston Bill, but gratefully I asked him if he was interested in doing it, and he said yes. He stepped away from the corner and onto the stage with me. I said to him, look, this is a solo show where I do this. I stand and I talk. And occasionally I move, but mostly for an hour I stand and I talk. And I would be much more interested if you came and stood next to me, rather than stood over there in another spotlight. And so we did 2 shows together with him interpreting the Preston Bill, and it was rather lovely. This solo performance became a duet between the two of us. And so signing was figuring large. I also have for many years wanted to write something for other people, and I often failed in that task, partly because I just ended up going, well, it's too complicated. It's much easier to just write something for myself. It's much more self-contained, it's cheaper. I don't have to organise a rehearsal room, I can just rehearse it in my living room. Or I can sit and think about it at my desk. But suddenly this figure of the signing character or signing person had appeared. And so finally I went, well, I can't sign, I can't possibly make that show myself unless I go and learn sign, which I haven't yet, for financial reasons mainly. So Summit had its origins, and so I started 2 years ago, nearly 2 years ago, to write down some ideas related to this play. And the play that has emerged from these thoughts is called Summit. It's a play about a meeting that tells a story of a meeting, and it will be performed for the first time in May at the Brighton Festival. And it has 3 people in it, none of whom are me. Hooray! So I've achieved my desire of writing for other people, because I realised very quickly that Summit, as a play, was a play that maybe was interested in exploring ideas of difference, an idea of difference. And as a nearly 45-year-old white male heterosexual from the north of England, I do not represent difference for a lot of people. So if I was going to stand on stage and go, hi everyone, welcome to my latest play about difference, that wasn't going to work, was it? Because it's me. So I realised that I needed some other people, so I've started to find and work with other people. A rather brilliant deaf and signing performer called Stephen Collins, an actor who was part of the Rants on the Moon project, the government inspector. A woman called Alicia Chuante, who is a black woman who lives in Liverpool. She's going to perform in the play. And the third performer I haven't found yet. I haven't found the third performer. But there are questions of language and questions of difference and ideas of otherness and ideas of meeting and ideas of togetherness in this play. And some of you will stay and hear a reading of the latest draft of the play, which I'm excited and a little bit nervous about later, because I haven't heard this draft read out loud. And it will be read in English. But when we get to rehearsals in April, 1/3 of the play will have been translated into BSL. And I will then, as a director, interestingly, not be able to fully understand the nuances of the play, which for me as a director is incredibly exciting. A lot of people have said to me, that must be quite hard to think about that, because you want to maintain your vision. And I don't know what I think people mean by that when they talk about directorial vision. I think they talk about one person potentially imposing their idea on how a play should sound and look. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in presenting something to a group of 50 or 60 or however many people in the room, and knowing that it's all seen and heard differently by 60 different people. And it feels to me, maybe I'm wrong, but it feels to me like exploring an idea of difference might be a good thing to be thinking about in the world at the moment. Because in the world at the moment, there are several, I'll use the word, threats to our difference. I feel like there are several threats to our ideas of difference and to conforming to what an idea of how people should be, how they should behave, how they should speak, what language they should speak. All of those things. So it feels to me to be an interesting time to be exploring that. And the play, as some of you will hear, it's not acted in the terms of people becoming characters, but there is an implication of the people that we are, the people that are performing the play, and also the people who are in the audience for the play. Everybody is kind of like a character in the play. Because it's a meeting. It's a meeting about a group of people in a room like this at a certain time. And the play tells the story in 3 different ways. In 3 acts. It's a 3-act play, very traditional. The first act is set 1,000 years in the future. And 1,000 years in the future, everybody in a utopian vision speaks different languages and understands everything that each other is saying, including sign language. So the story is told 1,000 years in the future. And then, so the people in 1,000 years in the future who look like this tell an audience 1,000 years in the future who look like this about the summit where everything changed. And then, in the second act of the play, we hear from a group of people 5 years ago. So they meet in a room like this, and they talk about how they need to sort something out. They need a summit to sort something out. Because things are going wrong. Things are difficult in the world, and things are going wrong. And it looks like this, and the people on stage look like this. And then in the final act of the play, we're at the summit itself. And the summit is a moment, a mythical moment. It's a myth. It's not a true story. And it's a moment where I have said, as the writer of the play, everything changes. Everything changes. So, it's an open text. I hope it explores ideas of strength, vulnerability, language, complexity. It will be performed by 3 people in an integrated way. So the 3 people will tell the story in sign and English, and at one point in another language entirely. And it's a new thing for me. I don't know, I'm still working on it. Be gentle with me. When we hear it in a bit, I might be going, oh no, that's not working, or I might be going, no, that's working, and I might be happy, and I might be worried, and I might be all of those things. But that's I guess, the idea and why I'm here, particularly on this day, to talk. Because I found myself following a hunch, and found myself in this world of, is it deaf theatre? Is it integrated theatre? What is it? Is it for a deaf audience? Is it for a hearing audience? And I've met some quite astonishing resistance and difficulty and questions around those things as I have progressed with this piece of work for the last year. In a really interesting way. Like people have said to me, oh, you're writing a play for a deaf audience. And I've gone, well, I'm writing a play. And a deaf audience will be able to understand it as much as a hearing audience can. But I hope that it will have both a deaf and a hearing audience, because I'm not interested in just writing a play for the deaf community. Because I'm interested in ideas of otherness. And so to try and write a play just for one constituency in this world of arts council applications where you have to say who your target audience are, it feels quite reductive to me sometimes to say, that's who it's for. Because I want it to be for not everybody, because not everybody likes to go to the theatre, but I want it to be for more than just one constituency. Yeah, there's lots of things, other things that I could say, and we will talk about maybe later and over the course of these 2 days that I'm here. It's really nice to be here. So, as well as the people that Simon mentioned, Sue McLean is somebody that you could look at her piece, Can I Start Again Please, which she's not touring anymore. but it's published in a very beautiful edition with both the BSL text and the written text next to each other. And also there's a company called the Deaf and Hearing Ensemble as well. I don't know if you've come across their work.
Yes, yeah.
They're also some people that I've talked to in the process of me trying to discover this stuff. I am not, when I was writing the notes for what I might say today, I wrote, I am not qualified. I'm not qualified as a, and that's another piece of resistance that I have met in the process of this. People have said to me, how could you possibly do that? You don't know, you can't sign, you don't know about theatre for the deaf community, or you don't know a lot about theatre for the deaf community. I know a lot more now, thanks to Simon. But that's kind of confounded me a little bit, because I think, does that mean I shouldn't enter into that discussion? Does that mean that I shouldn't be allowed into that club? If it does, I'm not interested in those clubs, because for me theatre is a place where we can kind of acknowledge difference or explore difference. That's why I got interested in it, and that's why I'm still doing it, I suppose, luckily, fortunately. I'll stop there, because there's probably loads of things that you want to say. Thanks. Thanks. Come on, let's all come up on the stage.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's really fun. I'm really
Pleasure.
looking forward to hearing.
Oh man, you might go, well, that's not what he said he was going to do.
So we've had lots of really interesting ideas and thoughts from Simon and Andy, and I'm just going to pass over briefly to Lucy. Lucy has put together and organised this residency of Andy with ourselves and South Street. So I don't know whether you had any specific thoughts or questions at this point, Lucy.
I've got loads of burning questions. I just want to say a big thank you to both of you for your contributions today. I'm just so interested in what you both said and how it intersects as well. And I had some questions, and I was trying to sort of pick up on what we could how we could combine what you guys have said. And I just wanted to go back to that phrase Simon used right at the beginning of his talk. You mentioned the phrase pioneer stage in theatre at the moment, and I just wanted to sort of pick up on that again, particularly in relation to Summit and what Andy's doing at the moment. I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more what you thought that was and sort of what's live now in terms of this practice and these issues.
Well, what I was referring to linked into the article that Colette Conroy wrote in relation to the Paralympics. You know, just to briefly say that, you know, the medical model of disability was all about, you know, it's the individual that's got sort of, you know, is not abled and has got a handicap, which is, you know, the word we don't use now. You know, and oh, poor them, you know, they haven't got access to the world the rest of us normal people and abled people have. You know, and then that was kind of rightly sort of tossed out the window. And the social model came in, which was actually to say, you know, actually, no, the problem resides with society, not the individual. And it's society that needs to think about all the various and different ways that we need to make our society accessible to everybody. And that, of course, can be about ramps for wheelchairs. That can, of course, be about braille. It can, of course, be about on the tube having kind of visual information and audio, you know, all kind of range of things, which we're still sailing with. But at least there is some law around now. But then, you know, and I'm on less firm ground here, but I think what Colette was and others within writing within disability arts are beginning to say, and certainly some disabled artists are saying, is, well, yeah, that's all very well. We've kind of put it all over into society now. But actually, we as individuals have an identity. We have an identity, and perhaps our identity is formed by hearing loss. Perhaps our identity is formed by, you know, our bodies and the physicality of our bodies. Perhaps our identity is formed by the way our mind thinks, you know, our mental state. And that's a part of who we are. So I think the argument now, and I don't know if we've got a fully formed model yet, whether we need a fully formed model even, but this, the identity of the artist can back into this. And I think it was led by disabled artists, particularly around the body as a site of performance. To say, actually, I don't want to just go, it's about society. How I can creatively communicate with my body is important to me. And I think that's where this kind of pioneering work now sort of happening, and probably has been for a few years now, to be honest with you. But so I think that's where we've evolved from, we're evolving from the social model of disability. And that's what I was referring to by pioneers.
Yeah, interesting in terms of how I am seen, how we are seen, how we see others, you know, and how notions of representation, I suppose. So representation is a really interesting word for me. And Tim Crouch, who I work with, we have this thing, which I think he's talked about as well, you might have heard him talk about this, Lucy, where we used to always go, oh, you know what Walter Benjamin said? Walter Benjamin said, all art is a problem of representation. All art is a problem of representation. I then found out, actually, he didn't say that. He said it is a characteristic of philosophical inquiry that it confronts ideas of representation. But for me, it's a similar thing, actually, you know, because art is about representation, representing something. And we make decisions on how we present and represent ourselves and things when we are on stage. And the stage is an interesting place for me because, as I've alluded to, it's a place where it might be quite simple actually for something else to represent itself as something else, whether that's a person or whether that's an object, you know, whether that's a chair. It's not a chair in Reading, but a chair in Brazil. So questions of representation and how we are represented are flying around for me. And they're flying around for me in the play as well, because of, I suppose, those things that I wanted to explore and also challenge. Those of you who stay to read to hear the reading of the play later, there is an idea that I am toying with in the second act of the play, which consists basically of the same speech 3 times, but it's delivered in 3 different ways. So it's first delivered in BSL, then gets spoken in English, and then the third performer that I haven't yet found, I'm looking for a performer who would be able to deliver that speech in another language, preferably for me, a South Asian language, like Bengali or Urdu, because I'm quite interested in what happens to us when we suddenly see somebody with a certain colour of skin start talking in another language, and how our perceptions and our representations of people, how they change when those things happen. It's territory which is really like, it's you know, it's contentious and it's questionable.
I just wanted to come back, Andy, to something you were talking about in terms of, you know, speaking about difference, because it seems to me that one of the things that both of you are doing, and you also, Simon, in your work with Tweeds, is creating a dialogue actually between the deaf and the hearing audience members. And that seems to address some of those questions about clubs that you were talking about. I mean, if we are actually trying to create a dialogue and an exchange, actually, then we need to get out of those clubs and particular, you know, constituencies and create an exchange and a dialogue.
Yes.
So I don't know if either of you have thoughts about that.
Well, I absolutely agree, and you know, I talked. What I'm thinking about in relation to that is in terms of deafness, is how people identify themselves as deaf, and I talked about the deafness either being regarded as a disability or as a cultural minority, and so that's why we get this small d, big D. I personally hate that. I'd rather just have D. I don't like that, you know. But in terms of writing about it, in order to clarify what I mean, I feel I have to use it. No, Big D deaf was very isolationist, I feel. It's very much kind of, you know, we are an ethnic minority, we're not a disability, this is our identity, our language is part of that identity. But of course that marginalised those that kind of perhaps started their lives as hearing and lost their hearing and learnt sign language later. They're apparently small D. Now, you know, I feel I don't feel very good about that kind of. So I think that dialogue. I think that kind of let's get out of those groups. Let's mix it in. But they are married to accessibility. And it's interesting listening to Andy talking, and I was thinking about the Fingersmiths actually, which was a company I referred to. And I know part of their work was to say, we don't want all of the audience to get everything all the same.
Yeah.
I mean, who does anyway?
Yeah,
Audiences
absolutely.
don't. You're sitting at a different angle,
Yeah.
you've got a different history, also,
Yeah.
we never do. But they were very consciously saying, actually we want some bits signed, some bits voiced, and some of the audience can get that, and some of them can't get this, and some, And I thought it was admirable. It actually seemed to be prejudiced towards hearing audiences, though, I felt. Because it's different modes of communication. So as a hearing member of the audience, although you might not understand sign language, because you can hear the verbal, you don't have to look at it. You can take that in and concentrate solely on the visual. Whereas a deaf member of the audience, you can't. You might not even know somebody's speaking. So all you can look at is that visual material. So to me, there's some contentious area around accessibility there.
If I could just pick up on that, because we had Kate O'Reilly coming here last year, and she talked about peeling. And there's one particular moment in peeling that she referred to, and that is where one of the characters, who is a hearing character, is reading out some banal list of ingredients in a cake or something quite banal. And the deaf character is signing in BSL an extraordinary history of abuses within the deaf community that were not sufficiently investigated, taken account of by the broader community.
Yeah.
And that is accessible only to the deaf audience or BSL literate audience. And so it was a moment where actually the deaf audience were completely privileged. Because they were hearing a story that addressed their history and that was not spoken, was not accessible to the rest of the audience. And it was a very politicised moment, I think.
Can I just come back on that? Because again, I'm sort of all for that. It's admirable. It's good. I think we should be. But of course, hearing loss, like so many other things, is a spectrum.
Yeah.
So once again, we've got the deaf people who don't sign, or deaf people whose first language is SSE as opposed to BSL. And I come back to kind of one of my early points, which is about the accessibility of mainstream theatre for deaf audiences. There's become a trend now, particularly in larger scale theatres, for captioning as opposed to sign language interpretation. The actual feedback from deaf audiences has been, we actually quite like the text, we'd actually quite like all the lines of the play. We don't want this interpreter's take on it, because there is a subjectivity about that.
It is an interpretation.
Exactly. It's not a translation; it's an interpretation. So actually, there's been much more move back to captioning. So I think it's a contentious area, and I think there's a lot of exploration to be had in this dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's time to open this up. Do you want to?
No. If students have got questions, if they don't, I can always ask them on that.
Yeah, teacher.
My question is just for Andy, really. First of all, I know Alicia, which is very nice.
Great.
We worked together before on projects. We did meditation together, very lovely woman. And my question is just about sort of the whole creative process. How does an idea form for you?
Right. So usually it begins with that thing that I said, you get a formless hunch where you just go, I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about this. And then slowly things start to maybe or maybe not circle around it in order to feed it in a way. So with this piece, very much, the idea was that I had this image in my head. I had an image in my head of somebody signing. And then I also had this thing about meeting. And then slowly I started to just piece the things together, really. And then sat down to try and write a bit and to see what would happen. And for me, slowly, things happen slowly. I have to coax them out slowly. Over a long period of time, 2 years, I suppose. This is going to be from original kind of, I'm thinking about this, to May the 8th, which is when it's going to be 7th and 8th, which is when it's going to be on in Brighton. 2 years, just over 2 years of kind of it gestating and changing, and for me to slowly understand what it is. I don't want that to sound mystical or mythical, because it's not. It's just about working hard on it, really. Yeah, it's just about slowly working it through and holding my nerve sometimes, because there's been, particularly with this piece, for lots of different reasons, that it's not me. I'm used to working with me, collaborating with me and having conversations with me about what me should be doing next, you know what I mean? But suddenly there's been more people in the room, real people. And so that's been a different and interesting process. It's not one that I'm unused to, because I work with Tim a lot and we've worked with other people, so it's not totally new. But you know, people come with their questions, and that's been exciting to have my instincts tested a bit. Alicia is brilliant at that. You know what I mean? One of the things that I've really liked about working with her is that she's just not afraid to go, "What are you doing then? What's this?" Because one of the things that I love are simple questions, like what is acting? I love that question. I could talk about it all the time, because sometimes I feel there's a presumption that's, well, you don't have to think about that. But I think it's really important to think about the simple basic questions, because the complexities that arise out of them are pretty massive.
Can I pick up on your question, just in relation to one of the things Andy said right at the end of his bit, about the fact that you won't understand some elements of this play when it's finished, and the sort of the deconstruction of that, or the sort of what happens to you then as a writer, and the idea of your role, kind of you know, the sort of political implication of that in relation to the question about process.
Right. For me, it feels like I'm sharing it.
Yeah.
And if I'm sharing it, then it means that it might be possible that I might be sharing something with an audience. And you talked about dialogue. Dialogue is really important to me. I mostly make solo work. But dialogue, my friend Carl James says dialogue is thinking together. That's how he defines dialogue. Dialogue is an act of thinking together. And sometimes when we talk about dialogue, we presume that it's a conversation, it's a two-way discussion. And it is a two-way discussion, but it doesn't have to be spoken. And for me, theatres are brilliant places to think together with other people. Yeah, so I'm interested in dialogue, and I suppose I'm interested, also talking about solo practice. This isn't solo practice that we're going to read, but mostly I've made a lot of solo practice, and I often say this is the most collaborative form of theatre there is. I have to look at everybody that's there and go, right, this is what we're doing. So it's lots of people. Solo practice is sometimes, I try to look at it in a different way and go, actually, it's potentially one of the most collaborative forms of theatre there is.
Any other questions? Yeah, great. Any other questions?
Yeah.
Bradley and then Ian.
Do you think after this performance you'll revert back to your kind of traditional kind of solo kind of performance, or will you continue to operate in the kind of similar way that you're doing now?
Great. I think I'm going to do both. I have an idea. I have another idea that I'm currently mulling over, which is a solo show. I know it's a solo show. I think it's an Andy Smith show. So, yes. And then I also have another thing, very, very tiny, like 2 weeks old, not even an egg in my head, of a thing that might be written for other people. So, I hope both. Nice.
Ian.
I'm not really sure if it's a question, but kind of more of an observation. When Andy was talking about what constitutes art, what constitutes theatre, and those kind of questions, it really reminded me, and this word pioneering, it really reminded me of Russia in 1917 and what the Bolsheviks used to do, and how they got theatre and cinema kind of away from the old imperialist buildings, and that was kind of taken out via trains into the masses. So you get what they call agit trains or kino trains. And these trains would go out into the masses, and they play to a little village. and the theatre there was often no kind of dialogue in the theatre. It was very demonstrative. And there was sometimes someone there who was telling you what was happening. And again, with the cinema, they kind of go out and you see a little picture show, kind of political, but it would be explained as you were kind of watching it. But also the impact of kind of constructivism, of getting art out of the gallery and putting art on the street. So art is for everybody. It's not just for the few. So I was just struck by a number of kind of similarities, because the Bolsheviks were having to kind of deal with a number of the questions you yourself raised. What constitutes that? We don't want to go back to old models of narrative and character and theatre and cinema. We need to find something new for these changing times.
Yeah, right. How thrilling to be thought of in relation to the Bolsheviks.
It did all change when Stalin came to power.
Of course.
There was that kind of brief that left, because one of the first things Lenin said when the Bolsheviks kind of took over, he said, for us, cinema is the most important of all the arts. So it was about kind of getting cinema and then getting kind of theatre out there in these sort of very little but very demonstratively performed plays, which often drew, I think, in the kind of dialogue of performance on kind of Meyerhold's ideas of biomechanical.
Yeah.
Can I pick up on that and ask a
Yeah.
question in relation to sort of, I suppose you've mentioned the word utopias and sort of communist utopias and the word ideal as well, and I just wanted to pick up on that basically. Simon talked about the spect audience, and Andy, you talked about this idea of the meeting and the sort of potential and idealness of that. And I'm wanting to ask both of you really, is there an ideal here? Sorry.
I can go first if you want.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah. You want to think about that, Simon? Yeah. So, for me, the theatre, as I hope I've illustrated, is a place of the imagination. The place of the imagination. And I think currently, we're not doing too brilliantly with our imagination. Certainly on the left, which traditionally has been a political inclination which is connected to the imagination, for good or ill, we're not doing too brilliantly there. And so, in relation to ideals and ideas and imagination, I'm excited by the theatre because of what it might be able to do in terms of how we might imagine something. We might imagine 1,000 years in the future, and it might look just like this. Yeah, this is 1,000 years in the future. So, I want to think about that. I also know that there is a failure in the imagination, which people don't like to talk too much about these days because they want to deliver. They want to deliver, results and goals and things like that. So for me, the word which leapt out of the articles that you sent around, Simon, was the horizon. There's a book that has been quite big for me called The Communist Horizon by a writer called Jodie Dean. And she talks about principles of communism, which have failed in many ways across the world. But the communist horizon for her is an important image because it's something you work towards but you never reach. So I, in my lifetime, will probably not see an equality, for example, that I would like to see, a gender equality, or what people call a race equality. But that doesn't mean that I shouldn't be working for it now. And I think there is a lot of thought, or, one of the examples that I think of just off the top of my head is the idea of paying taxes. People talk about paying taxes. I don't see what happens to my taxes. And actually, the principle of taxation, as I understand it, was set up for the future. You paid your taxes because of what was coming after you'd gone. So that's why you secured something for the people that came after you. Whereas now we look a little bit inwardly, I think, and we go, well, I should see the results of what I've given to the state. And so there's, oh man, I could talk about that for a long time. The horizon, an idea of the horizon and an idea of being able to imagine a possibility feels like an important thing. And this feels like a space in which we might be able to do that at the moment. And it feels like we need to do a bit of that at the moment, however many of us it might be. It might just be 4 or 5 or 6 of us. That's all right. You know, it's a space where we can do that. That would be my answer to your question.
And I think the simple answer is no. But I'm not sure if, is it desirable? What's coming to me about this is that Andy talked a lot about the importance of audience. And I think, I don't think we have an ideal situation at the moment in terms of audience and what we're putting in front of audiences and what audience expectations are. So when you get shows such as the Ramps on the Moon work and so on coming round, trying to break into the mainstream and not just be marginalised as disability theatre, the problems I think reside in audience expectations and what audiences are used to. We've got to address that. We've got to change that, and that may come down to how we publicise, how we market things as much as anything else, so that we don't get the mums who bring their children along and say, "Oh my God, I wasn't expecting to see that kind of person on stage," or that sort of, actually it's like, well, let's work against what you expected to see on stage. Let's get that diversity out there, and I think the more experiments that we've got, the better. I think we've got to address those audiences, and I actually think that a lot of that comes in the writing. One of my biggish areas of interest really is about employability of disabled actors, and are the roles there for them, and does it matter if they're not? Because you were talking about representation, the theatre, we could use the imagination. Which I think is more difficult in film and television, actually. But I think we've got to be challenging the way that we've written and the way that we write, and starting to write not just parts for deaf or disabled actors, but actually the whole construction of our writing, the whole kind of way that narrative is constructed, and that's where we start to get. We won't get to an ideal, but we start to move and shift. I just wanted to come back on your point as well, actually, because it's interesting talking about the Soviet Union. And in the kind of history of deaf theatre, the Soviet Union was at the pinnacle. They established a kind of acting school and produced many deaf actors, far more than anywhere else in the world, as far as I'm aware, for a short kind of period. Very prolific.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I think we probably need to bring all this to a close, this wonderful exchange of ideas, opening up horizons of possibility. So if you can join me in thanking Andy and Simon for their fantastic presentations. I think Lucy's going to take us through some logistics now, because you have to move. You've got a little time to breathe now, but at 4 o'clock?
Yeah, so I was just going to say, because people raise their hands if they're planning to come to the reading, just so we have a sense of who's going to be available, who's going to be in the space with us.
Nobody.
Bradley, okay, Bradley's coming, good. Excellent, okay, nobody else is available. Okay. So in terms
That's a shame, it's going to be really exciting.
Now?
No.
4 o'clock.
Until what?
Should take about an hour.
An hour.
Maybe a bit longer than an hour.
Yeah, if you can, please do, because I think it's going to be really, really
It
interesting.
might be rubbish.
Yeah, that's fine. I think there will be discreet ways in which, if you have to leave, you can leave.
Yeah, it's going to be very relaxed and a session of sharing Andy's play.
It's not, it's just reading through it.
So that's happening at 4, so we'll have a very, very quick break and then go up to the studio for that. We'd be delighted if people would like to join us for that. And then at 6, so we'll have a break in between. I'm going to have an in conversation with Andy, where we'll be picking up on some of these issues that we've discussed today, with Simon in particular. Great.
And John from South Street.
And John,
yeah. Go to South Street.
And John, because there's actually a sort of important conversation about sort of the regions and touring and things to have in relation to some of these set of conversations. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, the idea
Theory of Eddie Redmayne again, and the argument, and I've always been fascinated, it's very difficult to draw a character with, because there was a part of the film where he hasn't got one, but an able-bodied actor transformed. However, now, why did we think about that? Why not do that? Why not have one actor, Eddie Redmayne playing, and then you've got another actor? It's just creative thinking. But film's harder because we're so used to conventional being, it's very
Scripts with me.
as opposed to theatre where these chairs are now in Brazil. You can't do that to regional films.
So, nice to meet you. I don't think we've met, but I'm calling over us to shake hands. Thank you so much for volunteering to read. I've got the scripts in my box that I'm carrying around. But I guess what we wanted to do was like create a space in which we could have a conversation. So not only will you be reading, but your feedback on reading will be so important. And I can go through it with you beforehand, so don't be nervous or anything. Are you all right? Do you need any coffees, teas, anything? Hot drink, okay. So I'll introduce you to Andy. Should we just meet you guys up there in the space? Do you want to have a 10-minute break and then we can go from there? Do you know where Zoe's meeting us outside, isn't she? Would you mind scooping her up?